Hey everybody, this is Manny Faces, producer and host of Newsbeat. Back again with you guys for an episode of BackBeat, our behind-the-scenes look at the full episodes, to give some greater depth and insight as to the information that we provide to you in our Newsbeat episodes. We're here to discuss the latest episode, which is called Land of the Rich, Home of the Poor, America's Poverty Crisis. A very deep and emotional, I think in some regards, episode. We really touched upon some realities that are stark and perhaps unexpected when it comes to how those in our country who are poor are really facing hardships that I think go underreported and underappreciated. So, of course, we brought some great voices to the fray. We had another amazing lyrical contribution. As you guys know at Newsbeat, we merge social justice and civil liberty journalism with music and original lyrical contributions from amazing hip-hop artists. Our good friend Liquid rejoined us for this episode. She was stunning. The story itself is touching, and the stats are staggering. So we'll talk about it a little bit as we get into it here with the rest of the Newsbeat crew. Once again, just want to remind you that all of our episodes and information about us and who we are and what we do and why we do it can be found online at www.usnewsbeat.com. One of the places we'd like you to check out there, if you do like Newsbeat, if you are familiar with us, and if you haven't checked out the episodes yet, we urge you to do so before listening to the BackBeat. It's kind of like spoiler alert, you don't want to listen to the behind the scenes until you've seen the movie. If you like what we're doing and want to help us continue to do it, one of the things that we ask is you swing by our support page, usnewsbeat.com/support. It's a place where we do collect donations from you, the adoring public, because we want to make sure that we can continue to pay the artists. That's where that money goes. As a musician's advocate, I absolutely insist that artists are compensated for their amazing work, and we want to continue to do so. We all feel that way here, and through your help, we can continue to do that, to bring these incredible stories to life in a way that nobody else is doing. So please, usnewsbeat.com/support, and at the very least, subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Let people know what we're doing across your social media channels and in handwritten notes to your nana. So I'm here joined as always by my good friends and colleagues, the editor-in-chief of Newsbeat, Mr. Christopher Twarowski.
What up, Manny?
And the managing editor of Newsbeat, Mr. Rashed Mian.
Yo.
How you doing, fellas?
How's it going? Doing well.
Well, we want to get into it a little bit, speak a little bit behind the scenes, talk about this issue of poverty, America's poverty crisis that we covered in Land of the Rich, Home of the Poor. I thought that the insights provided by our voices were really incredible. We know about poverty in America. We know that there are poor people in America. We hear about welfare. These are all, hot button topics, in the news and the political rhetoric going on. But to really hear the insight of people who are taking the time to traverse the country and really dig in and inspect and go into the communities that are facing hardship, economic hardship. We find, of course, that it's across racial lines, across all demographics, all areas of the country, rural, urban, suburban. There's people facing what some of our guests even referred to as third world conditions. So it was really eye-opening, I think, to hear it in this kind of detail, and of course musically as well, and then complemented by Liquid's amazing insight as an artist and as a resident of this country. So let's go talk about it a little bit. Chris, you want to introduce, as you usually do, the amazing people who joined us for this episode?
Yeah, definitely. So we spoke with Philip Alston. He's United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, and also the John Norton Pomeroy Professor of Law at New York University School of Law, who, as you mentioned, traveled the country, compiling a report for the United Nations on poverty and what's also called extreme poverty.
Right. And this is something, I guess, with the United Nations, he's gone to other places in the world, so he has something to compare it against, right? This is the guy that knows. He's the special rapporteur on poverty.
We had a rapporteur on our program. It's cool.
Pretty high end.
We spoke with Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and co-director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, who also has been on a quest around the country, rallying communities, tens of thousands of people for this moral awakening to shine a light on these conditions that, as you mentioned, are so omnipresent, yet often go overlooked by mainstream media, definitely do not get the attention that they deserve.
And the Poor People's Campaign, of course, and the extension of the movement that was started by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.,
100%.
which we talked about, of course, in our episode MLK, What They Won't Teach You in School. We actually talked a lot about the Poor People's Campaign.
Right.
So it was something that we were familiar with, and not everyone understands that this is a big movement that was big then, part of MLK's legacy that was overlooked, as we talked about, and is now still very active and pushing for some of these issues.
Right. And for added emphasis, it is 50 years this year, 50th anniversary of that initial Poor People's Campaign, which Martin Luther King did not get to participate in himself since he was assassinated just a month or two earlier.
Right.
This year's initiative is going to culminate on a similar march to Washington, uniting the poor from across race, across the country, and really try to raise attention about this because, and we'll get into a little bit more in this backbeat here, but, the initial Poor People's Campaign, I think that the figures were 40 million to 60 million people at that time in 1968 living in poverty. And as you'll hear in the actual episode, there's more than 40 million Americans currently living in poverty, or 1 in every 8 citizens. So the problem is still as rampant now as it was then.
Yeah.
And lastly, we spoke to Pramila Nadesan, who's a professor of history at Barnard College, Columbia University, and co-founder of Scholars for Social Justice, a coalition of progressive academics trying to make a difference on topics like this.
Right. Fantastic. We had insights from all three of those individuals that, again, just from every angle that really, emphasized this problem in great detail.
I think that we could start off, Manny, with even just reiterating some of the stats that you spoke about in the intro.
Right.
That the biggest hypocrisy here, at least for me, the biggest irony is that we have one of the wealthiest countries, in certain parameters, the wealthiest country on the globe, and yet there are more than 40 million Americans living in poverty. To quote some of those stats that you mentioned in the intro there, that's more than 1 in every 8 citizen, or nearly 13% of the entire population. And about half of those are living in what's called deep or extreme poverty.
Right.
There's about 15 million children, or 21% of all children in the United States, living in families earning annual incomes below the federal poverty threshold and in dire conditions, as you stated, what can be described as third world countries.
Right. And that's not us saying that. That's Philip Alston saying it because, again, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty, he's seen some poverty in the rest of the world. And we get pegged as, the first world, the leader of the world, the richest country in the world. And to hear these kind of numbers attached to us, it's one of those things that you kind of know about. You know that there's people that are poor. You know that there are rural areas that are still not well off, and the economic conditions in some cities, in inner cities, are terrible. But these are big numbers. This is a sizable portion of the population that we're talking. We're talking about tens of millions of people, and something doesn't sit right there. We shouldn't, be having that kind of disparity economically.
And even going off Chris's numbers, there's even about 64 million people, which is basically a fifth of the country, that makes less than $15 an hour, which sort of, adds more emphasis to the push in the last couple of years to sort of raise the minimum wage to at least $15. Right. And even the experts who follow poverty and track economics say that's not even enough. And the federal minimum wage itself has not gone up since 2009.
Right.
Some states are trying to do that, but you're talking about a fifth of the country making less than $15 an hour.
Right. And we say, like, you hear now, or I don't want to say now. I'm not going to, because it's not just now in this recent administration, because obviously jobs were rebounding, the economy was rebounding before the Trump administration started. This is just a continuation of some of the economic decisions that were made by the Obama administration. But when you hear job numbers going up, jobs are going up, sure, that's great news. But what doesn't go up is the rate of pay.
Right. Wages are still basically haven't risen since the economic collapse in 2009.
Right.
But that's for normal people. But as we note in our story that we always tell people to check out at usnewsbeat.com that corresponds with each episode, we note that the top 3 years after the economic collapse, the top 1% earners netted 95% of the income gains in the country, which is just staggering. When you
So
think
they
about
got they got the wage increases.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's
and the banks got bailed out.
yeah, I mean, there's the wealth of 3 people in the country. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett is the equivalent of the collective wealth of 40% of the public. Right. I mean, so underscoring all of this poverty is this massive income inequality gap, which I believe the United States is the worst in the world. As that deepens, as that widens, these conditions not only persist, but they only worsen.
Right. So what are some of the things that we found that we didn't get into in the episode? Some added stuff that I think people would be truly interested to hear. Obviously, if you've heard this episode, there's emotion there. We hear these stats. Some of this stuff could be spun. Again, you could say jobs are going up, wages may follow. The tax bill is supposed to make companies have more money, and to dish it out to their employees. Maybe that's going to help. We don't know. Rashed, you brought up some interesting stats as we were talking before we went in about how politics plays a role in this, and how a good number of people who are voting with the economy in mind may have come from some of these very, very poor areas and really placed their votes expecting some kind of change or benefit to them. What was it that you found?
And, obviously one of the things we heard a lot after the election, which the popular vote that Donald Trump lost by 3 million, but was that a lot of so-called working class white people came out to support Trump, which also ignored, the affluent people in suburbia that also supported him. But the media really honed in on this idea of working class white people that came out in droves to vote for Trump.
To elect the businessman president.
Yes, for the Electoral College to elect Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of interested in finding out where are some of these poorest counties in America, which states, where do they reside, and how did they vote? Just doing some sort of basic research, there's 2 indicators. There's lowest per capita income, and there's median household income. And in terms of lowest per capita income, 4 of the 5 lowest, basically poorest people in the country in these counties voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Some of them by sizable numbers. There was one county, Bledsoe County in Tennessee, where the personal income was $20,000 on average, $20,000 a year, and they elected Trump by a margin of basically 60%. They supported him. There's also, like I mentioned, there's the median household income. 3 out of the 5 elected Hillary Clinton in some of these states, but if you go down the list, there's more. You notice more of a trend of these people supporting Donald Trump.
So overall, the trend that you see is that poorer counties, in America tended to vote. I don't want to say for Trump, but because
I mean these are some of these are deep red states.
So they may
it's really not a surprise.
Right. Yeah. They may traditionally vote Republican. They continued to vote Republican. In this, but perhaps in some cases overwhelmingly so. I think it's always the economy, right? You hear it's the economy stupid all the time with elections and such. So would this be sort of an extension of the poorer people because you don't see that in poor urban areas that may tend to vote Democrat, right?
You see that, especially in the cities. These are, from what we can tell, these are a lot of rural areas in the country.
Now, what I find ironic about that is, and as you hear from the episode, you find out that some of the rhetoric, some of the political rhetoric, and some of the discussion has been aimed at the welfare state, the abuses of the welfare state. Sort of an attack on poor people. I don't want to say an attack, but
it's a criminalization of the poor.
Criminalization of the poor.
But politicization too, like as you mentioned, when you're yelling and screaming about these things at a rally, and look, it goes without saying that most of the people that voted for Donald Trump were white people.
Right.
And when these people that came out to his rallies were, I think it's easy to say at least 90%, white people came to his rallies.
At least.
So when you're yelling and screaming about welfare, the picture that people have in their heads is black people,
Right.
or Spanish people,
Right.
people who are, as Alston says in our episode and has said in his preliminary report, there's this sense that they're just sitting around the sofa watching TV,
Right.
doing nothing all day,
Sure.
and just sort of munching on taxpayer dime, right?
But as we know, and as Reverend Theo Harris talked about in the as everyone talked about in the episode,
Basically, yeah.
that poverty is across racial lines. That most people in the country who are declared poverty or extremely poor are white, just by the raw numbers. Now, poverty does disproportionately affect people of color. So there's sort of.
But I think an extra there's 8 million more poor whites in America than
Right.
blacks.
And I think that her quote was something like, the poster child of poor in the country currently is a 9-year-old white girl.
Right.
So if you follow, especially the Poor People's Campaign, which I think is an amazing movement that sprouted up again, as you guys mentioned, following the lead of Martin Luther King's movement in 1968 before he was gunned down. The amazing thing is they're building a coalition. To them, this is not about race, which is important because they're just trying to raise up the lives of ordinary Americans, whether they're white Americans, black Americans, Latino, Native Americans, Asian American, people of all shapes, genders, colors, which is important because as we're mentioning, it just affects a wide swath of the country. And one aspect that didn't get touched on enough, a lot in the episode, is basically just the income gap just widening in this country.
Right.
So I think there was a stat that we had where it was a Pew Research report recently that found that the wealth gap between the upper income households and low and middle class families are at the highest levels ever recorded in this country.
There's almost no middle class anymore.
Right, the middle class has disappeared, which Liquid sort of mentions in her verses. The middle class is disappearing and it's shrinking, which I think is even more important to talk about poverty in America today. Especially, I wish the mainstream media and cable news outlets would focus on this a little more, just to bring attention. Maybe even by raising more awareness, people will be more empathetic to the plight of these people who are really suffering. And I think it's Pramila Nathan who said it's basically, for some people, extreme poverty is a death sentence.
Right. These are people who are living on the edge, could be steps away from dying just because of their lack of resources.
That 40 million figure of Americans living in poverty, it quickly balloons to 140 million, which is what Reverend Theo Harris told us, when you just consider low-income households.
Right.
Philip Alston, when he's walking around the country and such vivid scenes of such disparity and, quote, grim conditions, he called it, where there's actually, raw sewage, flowing into these tent encampments of people who have zero money and are, basically living in mud, eating out of dumpsters. But the sort of wider portrait of poverty is that I believe the stat is, in case of an emergency, if you polled American families who could amass just $400, mobilize it quickly for an emergency, only 50% of households would be able to do that. Let that sink in for a second. I mean, $400.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's much bigger than the stats, and the stats are just shocking.
Right, because there's extreme poverty, there's poverty, and then there's almost poverty.
Right. I mean, how many people do you know living paycheck to paycheck?
Of course, a lot of people are paycheck to paycheck who are, quote unquote,
well off,
doing okay. My bills are paid, I have an apartment, I have a car note, or whatever the case may be, but I don't have much more than that.
Right.
And that's not poverty, and it's not putting me in the same boat, but once you have one or two of those emergencies pop up, you can spiral out of control. That we see this happening with communities that are targeted even worse because they get a couple of parking tickets, speeding tickets, or then they have to miss work for a couple of days, and then so they're paid hourly, right? So now they don't have as much money. Then they're late on a payment. Then they get a charge fee. Then their bank account, now they get hit with an overdraft fee. I forget who it is who said it, but one of the best quotes I ever heard, I should remember who said it, was, it's incredibly expensive to be poor. Mm-hmm. Because these things it just doesn't go smoothly for you anymore. And then before you know it, well, now you're late on your car note gets and then before you know it, you're right there at the same level. You're right there, at almost poverty.
To that point, Alston, I recently watched a video of his press conference unveiling or just sort of his preliminary findings of the report, where he talked about this criminalization of poverty. And, the example he gave was just take a regular homeless person that you see, okay? And what he witnessed was, the police telling these people who don't have anywhere to go, move along, move along, move along. And one woman asked the police, well, where should I go? And he said, I don't care where you go. You're not going to go here. And so, it's illegal to loiter. It's illegal to sleep or to sit on a bench for too long in America. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is the homeless person then gets arrested. And what typically happens with loitering or something like that, you get a fine. Well, you don't have any money if you had money, you wouldn't have been on the bench in the first place. Now you're hit with a fine that you can't pay.
Right.
So that fine doubles, triples, quadruples. Next thing you know, there's, you get picked up. Oh, you have these unpaid fines. This is several $1,000s. It's a misdemeanor charge.
Right.
You end up in jail. And that's a whole other world. Then you end up in jail.
Same thing as we talked about in past episodes. You hop a turnstile because, I just don't have the MetroCard money. In New York City, a place, the center of the world, you hop a turnstile, you don't got a lot of money. And next thing you know, you get slapped with a ticket. You obviously can't pay for that. You might not be able to miss work to attend the summit, your date in court. And it's a spiral. And again, it's expensive to be poor. It's hard to get out of that.
And I think that spiral you guys are talking about is important because, when it comes to welfare, and we spoke with Pramila Nadison, who's an expert on the welfare system in the United States. And one of the things that she discussed with us is this notion that people on welfare are not trying to work, who are basically just sitting at home.
Right.
But she cited a University of Michigan study that looked at poor people over decades that found 90% of these people were cycling in and out of welfare, which indicated that they were in and out of jobs. Right. So these are people who are trying to get jobs, who are actually working for periods of time, but will lose their jobs for, a number of factors, be it,
seasonal,
whatever it is. It could be seasonal
whatever,
employment, or they could just lost their job. Maybe they had to go to a doctor's visit and they couldn't take off of work. They're in a job where they somehow inconvenience their employer. So it's just another aspect of what you guys are talking about, how you're just living day by day, and these are not people who are just trying to live off the social safety net. The social safety net is actually working. That's what it's supposed to be. People who are maybe losing a job, supporting them so then they could get a job again instead of just falling into a deeper state of poverty, basically, a black hole, and then you're homeless.
Right. So she mentioned that the people abusing the system. Sure, that happens. Of course, it happens. Again, we're never painting with any kind of wide brush here, but the statistics show that that's not the prevalent problem, and that the welfare system generally works to help people in those cases when they need it. What I loved about what she brought up, I think it was her who brought it up in the episode, was let's also look at how we're defining welfare. There's other aspects of welfare that benefit people who aren't poor. Corporate welfare. What was it? I
think she said basically tax rebates,
right? Tax rebate. Education, right? Loans, things that you're able to get,
right?
that are.
Or every parent has a child that they write off,
right? That's sort of a welfare, in a way. It's not the safety net kind of welfare, and some of those things benefit people who have means to begin with.
Right. And there's also this vilification of the people who are sort of living off the taxpayer dime, supposedly, but not the rich people who are, storing or hoarding their money offshore.
Right.
Not even paying their taxes? Why are they not being vilified as much,
Well, that's because there was some politician who said that not paying taxes makes him smart or something like that.
Right. No, that's a great point too. And, Alston brings it up too, in that you talk about fraud, on his sort of fact-finding mission, all he hears that stereotype, the welfare
queen,
and there's so much fraud, and yet what about the white-collar crime fraud? What about the multi-billion dollars fraud? You don't hear about that. Why is that? Because those people have the money to defend themselves and to get away with it.
Right.
I think it's worth noting too when we talk about the politicization of this whole thing here. Both parties have blood all over their hands. I think one of Alston's lines was something like, the fact that we can see it and it's still an issue now means that it was pervasive throughout Democrats and Republicans. The point with the tax reform, and to your point, Rashed, about how those with the most to lose voted for the wolf in the room, right? Well, now you have a president who just passes, quote, tax reform, his quote, big, beautiful tax reform where 80% of those tax benefits go to the top 1%. And at the same time,
at a time where we have a poverty and welfare crisis.
And at the same time, there's talk of chopping nearly $2 trillion from the social safety net programs
Right.
to
SNAP,
pay for that very
SNAP
same,
and all
quote,
that,
reform.
Right. And as you mentioned, obviously people are sort of waiting for that the attack on the welfare programs. Madison mentioned, policies enacted under President Bill Clinton, the Democrat, who had the 1994 crime bill, which you mentioned was criminalizing the poor.
Yep.
Because especially when you talk about the war on drugs and how that disproportionately impacts African American communities, and the 1996 welfare bill, which made it harder for people to live under that social safety net to get them out of poverty. So as Chris mentions, and it's more important to emphasize, is that this is a bipartisan, basically, attack on the poor, which sort of doesn't make sense. And I think Alston, we keep mentioning, I think everybody should just read the report, because it's really helpful. But he has a very pragmatic approach where he says inequality is not a good strategy. It becomes more expensive. The poor are suffering. Healthcare costs are on the rise. The healthcare industry in the United States is not as good as they are in certain other countries, especially in Europe. So he said it's actually not good for the health of the nation moving forward, and it should be addressed.
Right.
And let's just talk about the fundamental here is that everyone should have the right to basic necessities and services.
Right.
And that's what's at the heart of this episode here.
Right. To hear that Flint, Michigan is still a thing.
Yeah.
To hear them talk about going to places in Alabama.
Right.
And, families don't have.
And the hookworm disease has reemerged.
Hookworm disease has reemerged. That there's tens of thousands of people in different areas that don't have clean drinking water, that don't have access to proper indoor plumbing, that, Skid Row in Los Angeles, where you talk about
1,800 people homeless.
Homeless encampments, what do they call them? Tent cities.
Tent cities, yeah.
Right? That this is something that we haven't been able to solve. If 40 million people were in poverty in 1968, and 40 plus million people are in poverty now. Granted, we have more people now.
And child poverty, according to a recent report, has actually gotten worse since
Children.
The child, just a little factoid here.
Yeah.
A child born in the United States is 76% more likely to die before their first birthday. And those that survive have a 57% greater risk to die before adulthood.
Compared to who?
All developed countries.
That's insane.
Just to quantify here.
Yeah.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Nations, basically all the richest nations on the planet.
Right.
We have the highest child mortality rate of all quote developed countries in that group.
And that's some of the stuff that Alston mentions. He doesn't drill down like Chris just did.
Right.
But some of these indicators, these organizations have found that we're sort of at the bottom of the developed countries that they monitor. And it's amazing. I think it's another point, again, that Alston makes in his report. It's that this is one of, and as Chris said, by some parameters, one of the richest country in the world. Sure. We spend more on our military than it's either the five or six combined, other countries combined. Instead of mobilizing some of that money to help the poor, it's now also going to give people who are already rich and well off and who are already at not even the top 1%, the top 0.5% of the income bracket, more money to spend.
And we make money off of poor people in a variety of ways. The private prison system, for example. There's so many ancillary industries, and we've talked about obviously the bail bond industry and all these other, again, that tie into the criminalization of the poor that are drivers of a certain economy for a certain group of people.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of incentive to just help people for the sake of helping them.
Right.
Because someone would have to give up something.
Right, and a lot of these private entities are campaign contributors.
Yeah, and this is the last time we'll mention Alston, please, today. But
Alston is the man.
He is the man. A lot of some of the counties that he visited, the police were blatantly revenue generators, agencies, as opposed to law enforcement agencies. Right. These infractions, whether it's an infraction or something larger, they were balancing the budgets basically off of the number of tickets.
And the most recent example, obviously, is Ferguson, Missouri.
Yeah.
When
he calls it the Ferguson effect.
The Ferguson effect, when the Department of Justice went in after Michael Brown was slaughtered in the streets, they found that basically, as Chris mentioned, they were, the city budget was being. They were able to compensate people based off of tickets and infractions from the black community there.
It's the Boss Hogg Dukes of Hazzard style of. You remember Dukes of Hazzard? That like crazy, like low key racist show that was like on TV for a bunch of years. They would always, whenever the country music stars would come through the town, the police would pull them over and give them a ticket and let them off if you just played a concert for free.
Okay.
So at the end of the show, you'd always have like Twangy Sneeds and the long hairs playing.
I hope you could play a clip.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I'm joking, but this is not a laughing matter, of course, because this is exactly what happens. And Ferguson was only caught because there was a Department of Justice investigation into them, and they are probably indicative of a million small rural townships across the country that are doing the same thing. Again, making money off of the poor. And as they say, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Right.
So, so there's a confluence of things happening here.
Yeah, there's
with
a
everything.
lot. Yeah, it's not just one or two things.
What were the as we always try to tell people who listen to Newsbeat and hear these issues, there's things you can do. We want to make sure you get involved. If you read Alston's report, you get a better insight as to what's really happening in the in the shadows of our nation.
It's exhaustive, and it's not even his full report that comes out in June.
I'm sure it is. Obviously, on an individual level, this is something that is far reaching. It's not like you can go out and do too many things on an individual level, because you're talking about a nationwide problem. You're talking about political. You're talking about institutional. There's a lot of things at work here. What does an Alston suggest? Or he said he's pragmatic about some things. Like what is being done as a country? Like is our federal government just asleep at the wheel on this now? Contributing to making the problem worse.
So one of the points of Alston's report was not to come up with specific, drilled down recommendations. He does highlight these things and make these reports available, and does meet with respective governments to stress these things. Shockingly, maybe not shockingly, he asked for a meeting with the DOJ, and they never return his calls, or they just flat out refuse. So he calls for an integrated approach to this. Again, this is so multi-tiered.
Yeah.
I mean, I would suggest, as we often do on the BackBeat, some groups. He mentioned two on his trek across the country. One was a church, St. Boniface in San Francisco, that they have such a homeless issue there that the church, in between masses and whenever the church was not in session for a congregation, would let the homeless sleep and sit in the pews. And when he asked the administrator there, this is great. I mean, this is a great use of resources, and she said, we only know of one other church in the entire country that does this. A second group he brought up, what I think is insanely overlooked. I definitely did not think about this, but just as everyone here, everyone listening, has to go to the dentist every now and then, think about being homeless. Your teeth, your physiology, your teeth don't change. I mean, they're going to rot out. They're going to get infected. You're going to need to go to a dentist,
right? And
they obviously don't have the money, and so what happens? Their teeth rots out. That he uses an example. Their breath smells. That also helps prevent them from getting a job. They show up at a job and they have teeth coming in. But he found in West Virginia a group called Health Rights, completely volunteer run. They go around with a mobile unit of dentists and nurses.
And other medical issues too, right?
And they treat, I think, over 21,000 people per year.
Wow.
So these are groups out there making a difference. I mean, obviously Human Rights Watch and stuff. I mean, there's so many groups.
And Theo Harris mentions this too. Also, it's basically, if you want to address the issue, ask the poor themselves and see what they would do to, change their situation. And she mentioned a couple of things. There was in Michigan, the way they're trying to, better improve the water quality there, little things like that.
Yeah.
The neighborhood community initiatives that don't get a lot of fanfare, like the hospital the mobile hospital that Chris mentioned in West Virginia,
right,
that are doing the work that, you would maybe expect a state or local government, to help out and do. So that's one initiative. And I think the other thing that Alston mentions is just it's more of a philosophical notion where, this is a big country and people have a lot of views. We sort of need to drill down on people that, we're really actually supporting one another. The person down the block who might be out of a job and is getting some assistance for a few weeks, they're not trying to do this intentionally. They're just trying to stay afloat while they could better themselves and get a job.
Right.
So, it's just this idea that people are not trying to munch off the welfare system like the stereotype suggests.
Right.
I think that's important, Don't give in to the stereotypes.
Right.
When you see someone homeless on the street, as Rashed just said, no one wants to be homeless. I mean, let's put it that way.
Right. No one wants to be in poverty across the country.
No one wants to be.
There's poverty traps. There's where it's, I don't want to say easier to be in poverty. I mean, if you look at it and say, well, there's no child care available. So how can I go to work if I have to watch my child and there's no, affordable child care in my area, or there's no jobs available in my area that pay me, enough to then you're kind of trapped in this cycle. But I don't think that the people would say, I don't want to go work and earn a living and make more money than I get today. You know what I mean? Like, I agree with you. I don't think anybody wants that. I think that most people don't want this, and they're looking for solutions. But when your community doesn't have clean drinking water,
right,
then it's not very likely that your community is going to be supplying great jobs, or that your local government who supports the police coming through your neighborhoods, white, black, rural, everywhere, and just feasting on your paychecks with traffic infractions, and other things along those lines. You're getting the raw end of the stick, and as we saw who they voted for, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the solution they were hoping for.
Right. But, I think when we were talking, just outside that, you imagine how, they heard someone come through their town say, I'm going to bring back jobs. I'm going to bring back this industry that sort of was hit hard by so-called globalization, or, this company was moving some of its jobs to Mexico or other countries. When you hear someone come through like that, they sort of sound like your savior.
I get it.
You could sort of understand why they would vote for, the person who's loudest and saying that.
The guy with the gold-plated toilet seat.
Right. They might ignore that, but Trump was also the person, shouting some of these like Bernie Sanders-like things, like everybody's going to have health care, when he was on the campaign trail.
Right. And again, everybody's going to get a bigger paycheck in your taxes, and then it turns out that you're getting a little bit extra.
$1 $1.
Yeah, you're getting a little extra in your paycheck, but it's not like that. And the jobs may be continuing to do well on the comeback, but your wages aren't increasing. And not only that, are those factory jobs coming back? Are those coal mine jobs coming back as you were promised?
Right.
Probably not.
Or what can government do to help you transition to another profession?
Right, exactly. So is that happening? Are all the things that you expected to happen? Or you just, say, well, yeah, you'd get all this stuff done if you would just, stop talking about Russia.
Self-inflicted wounds.
We'll see how it goes. But the bottom line is that it continues to be a huge problem in our country, a really sad one. And again, this is, another thing that crosses all races, demographics, genders, and age groups. Poverty-stricken children, poisonous water, raw sewage in your neighborhood, tent cities.
Yeah, and then Theo Harris mentioned to us, children dying in the parents' arms because, there was no Medicaid coverage for their child, and they couldn't go to a doctor.
And Alston gives the devastating stat that statistically, we talk about child mortality, and of these millions of children born into poverty, they'll likely not escape if things remain the same or worsen even more.
And they haven't so far in decades now.
Yeah.
So and of course we mentioned, just as a quick reminder, we mentioned all the groups that are doing this work to either find out more about or get involved with.
Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
Definitely.
The Poor People's Campaign is definitely the one that you might want to look into, just to obviously stay on top of.
Yeah.
I find that every time we mention these organizations, we follow them on Twitter, we follow them on Facebook, because they put out information. They put out articles, they put out studies, they put out reports, they put out news. And, when we're in a world of fake news, real news, all these things happening, some of these organizations, Human Rights Watch, Poor People's Campaign, I don't really see this as being a left-right biased kind of thing that they're doing. They're pointing out areas of need in the country. And again, with poverty, with this episode, why it speaks so much to say, hey, white people, it's not the welfare queen, black woman, 78 different babies. It's not about immigrants taking your jobs, and all these, the part of the rhetoric. But there are poverty-stricken white people that also need the right kind of treatment from the government that they're not getting. People of color disproportionately fall into poverty, and they're disproportionately targeted. So it may be less numbers, but certainly a higher percentage of their population. Children being born into poverty. There was a crack epidemic. There was an AIDS epidemic. These things have now there's an opioid epidemic. You know what I mean? There's so many factors that are bringing communities down.
It's also, you just got to try to get away from the stereotypes.
Right. That's like this. You're right.
And it's hard because, we mentioned race a lot in this episode, but it's also, like I said, it's the stereotypes because, when Trump came into office, there was a report from NBC News when he met with leaders of the African American caucus that when one leader told him that, I'm in a community that's stricken by poverty and not all people there that are poor are black, he was surprised to hear that. He was shocked. He said, he quote said, so who are they? So, when it's the president of the United States, granted, one would argue that someone who's elevated to such a position would have done the research and would have had, known what the stats are. But, he is an indication that there's millions of other people who just don't understand it.
Sure. And some of them are the ones that are actually
in poverty, which is sad. Yeah. So, but definitely the Poor People's Campaign, as you mentioned, because, they're crisscrossing the nation still. They're hitting these communities. You might find out, you wouldn't know, but maybe they're going to your community sometime soon, and it might be you might be interested in getting involved or just listening to what they have to say.
Right. So powerful, so educationally. I just recently went to their website and checked out some of the videos they put up. I mean, at each stop, they make a top priority giving voice to the locals there, and you hear it's just.
Well, Rashed said it.
Moving.
If you can't fix the problems, if you don't hear what the problems are, and there's no one who's going to tell you more than the people who are going through it themselves, and typically those voices have been underrepresented. So, in the spirit of what we like to do here at Newsbeat is to help provide a platform for those voices, even through those organizations. Maybe this is the first time you've been hearing about the Poor People's Campaign. Maybe this is the first time you've been hearing about Philip Alston's work documenting what's happening throughout the country. Human Rights Watch, other things we've been talking about. So we're helping elevate their voices. They're helping elevate directly the voices of the people who are going through these issues. And, that's what we're doing. We're trying to bring stories of social justice and civil liberties to your ears through the Newsbeat podcast. Make it hot. Make it sound good.
And special shout out to Liquid, who
in this episode,
who really weaponized this ongoing war against poverty.
Yep. Once again, Liquid. You could check her out at iamliquid.com. I know that she's about to put out a new project, so I want you guys to check her out. She's on Twitter at AKA Liquid. Liquid is spelled Likwuid. Likwuid. And of course, usnewsbeat.com. We have all the information about all the voices and all the artists that participate in all of our episodes. We have a full cover story which goes into greater detail. So again, we kind of just shoot the breeze here at BackBeat and talk about some of the things. Very well researched and written. Full cover story goes with each episode. So again, more information can be found there. We encourage you to look up and follow the Poor People's Campaign and some of the other organizations and groups that we've talked about in this episode. And we encourage you, of course, to follow Liquid and continue to follow us. So again, follow us on Twitter, US Newsbeat. Follow us on Instagram, US Newsbeat. Follow us on Facebook, US Newsbeat. And if you'd like to, if you feel so inclined to help us contribute to bring these amazing artists to the forefront, you can go to usnewsbeat.com/support. And we have received some donations. I'm going to gather up those names and give them a shout out on the next
Big
best
shout
beat.
outs.
So we've been receiving some love on the donation tip. We are looking for bigger and better ways to deliver our messages to everyone. But in the meantime, in between time, what you could do is donate a little bit to our support page. It goes directly to these wonderful artists from the independent music community that we're so blessed to have their perspective and their talent join us on Newsbeat. So we'll be back soon with another full episode. Again, all of our past episodes can be found wherever you find podcasts. You're undoubtedly subscribed by now. Wherever you are subscribed, feel free to rate, review, Give us a review if you have something to say. That helps. Everyone wants to know before they subscribe to a new podcast what the deal is. So make sure you give a good review if you feel so inclined. Share us with your friends. Word of mouth goes a long way. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Contact us, usnewsbeat.com. There's a contact form there, and we can be found all over the web, like I said. My name is Manny Faces. I'm the producer and host of BackBeat and Newsbeat. Once again, on behalf of Chris Twarowski, our editor-in-chief, Rashed Mian, our managing editor, Mr. Jed Morey at the top of the chain and part of the Morey Creative Studios umbrella that houses us all, to that entire team, including Jeff Main with the incredible artwork on all of our episodes. My MS Paint skills would embarrass us. Luckily, we have Jeff Main to provide all the great artwork that you see on all of our episodes. Thanks for listening. We do appreciate you. We appreciate your ears. We appreciate you sharing us, and we will talk to you soon. Peace.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Twarowski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat.